Hello, comrades. This is the Finnish Bolshevik, and I'm gonna be answering your questions. This is probably gonna be multiple parts. I think I'm gonna make each part 30 minutes long. Alex asks, how is it that you speak English so well? I don't know. Thanks, I guess. It's taught at school, so there's that, of course. But I think it's mostly just because of the internet and because of American and British media. Video games, movies, reading books in English, talking to people in English. Like, that's probably why. His second question was, what first got you into communism? What first got me into communism was, I used to be sort of a left-leaning liberal type, kind of apolitical, but when I started to be interested in Finnish politics, I was sort of a liberal leftist. And then, I don't remember exactly why, but I started looking into Marxist economics. Maybe it was just curiosity. But I basically went on YouTube and I searched like Marxist economics. And what came up was a series of videos by Richard Wolff, who is an American Marxist economist. And he was doing this course about like the basics of Marxist economics. So I started watching that and I started learning about that, and it made a lot of sense to me. It took me probably like a year after that I stumbled upon like Jason Unruh and other people like that who were doing actual like more Leninist content. And that was kind of the catalyst for me to start looking more into that, reading stuff by Lenin, and that's how it happened. But I think that even before I was really into Marxism, I started to like the idea that workers would own their own means of production. I didn't know that was socialism, I didn't know that was Marxism, but it just, I heard that idea somewhere and it just made sense to me because workers are the ones who do all the work, you know. A capitalist doesn't really contribute anything to the productive process or the production process. So that was kind of something that always made sense to me, that if we just get rid of the capitalist, then that should make every production process more efficient and the workers would get more of their value because there would be no capitalist just leeching off that value. 3. Why aren't you a Maoist? Well, basically, I do agree with most of Mao Zedong thought, and most of, like, generally speaking, I do agree with most of what Maoists have said historically. I'm much more of a Maoist than a Hobbyist. There's a number of reasons why. Basically, if you just list out the things that Maoism is, and, like, then you just see if you agree with those, then, you know, there's People's War. Well, I mean, People's War makes sense. Like, I support groups that do actual People's War, but People's War is not really... I don't think People's War is universal, or universally applicable, the way some Maoists do. So that's one reason. Also, People's War is a military strategy. Like, of course it has a connection to politics, but at the end of the day, like, People's War is mainly a military strategy. It's like guerrilla war. So to me, it seems kind of odd that you would basically say that, okay, this is a new political ideology, it's called Maoism, and one of the key tenets of it is like a military strategy. That just seems a little bit odd to me. Not to mention that, even if you think that People's War is like universally applicable and it's great, I mean, there's all these Marxist-Leninist and Hobbyist groups basically doing People's War as well. Like, there's like the Turkish Hobbyists, I don't remember what they're called, like the Marxist-Leninist Party of Turkey or something. And then, of course, FARC, and all of these groups which haven't been Maoist, but they're still basically doing the same thing, more or less. Okay, then there's like New Democracy. New Democracy is a transition period basically from a semi-colonial or semi-feudal country to a socialist country. So it's basically trying to bridge that gap, like, from a country that's not really properly capitalist but wants to become socialist. It's like trying to be the transition from semi-feudalism, semi-colonialism to socialism. Now, again, that makes sense. That's a good strategy. That's smart for China, for Vietnam, and for all of these countries. But it's only applicable for colonial or semi-colonial or semi-feudal countries. So it would be kind of odd if I, as a Finnish person, was like all, you know, excited about New Democracy, because New Democracy
wouldn't be something that Finland would even have. And if you just like want a really simple answer, like all these things together, like in my opinion, Maoism is just Marxism-Leninism applied to the conditions of semi-feudalism, semi-colonialism, instead of an actual, like, proper ideology. Like, I do understand that it is an ideology, but I don't put Maoism on the same level as Marxism or Leninism in terms of how much it developed. Like, of course Mao came up with a lot of stuff, but so did people like Che Guevara or Stalin or, you know, a number of these other people who wrote a bunch of books and came up with a bunch of ways of applying theory and ways of doing things. So, yeah, in my opinion, Maoism is just taking Leninism and applying it, and it's, you know, it's valuable, but it's not universally applicable, and I don't think it's a universally a higher stage of Marxism. Okay, 4. What do you do for a living? I do computer and IT-related work for my local city. Computer work, tech support, stuff like that. 5. Do you get backlash for supporting the USSR as a Finnish guy, since historically the two countries were always enemies? Keep up the good work, comrade. Yeah, thanks. I do get some backlash, but, you know, not as much as you would maybe think. But the thing you said about, you know, historically the two countries have always been enemies, that's sort of a misconception, to be honest. Like, Finland has just been a very divided country for a very long time. Pretty much for the entirety of its existence, you know, the existence of modern Finland, which is, Finland is a relatively new country. We gained independence in 1917. And ever since then, it's been a very divided country. Like, almost immediately, in 1918, there was a communist revolution. The communist revolution was partially caused by just the fact that people wanted a revolution, but it was also kind of caused by white terrorism and white terror. Basically, there was a power vacuum, so both the Red Guards and White Guards began to arm themselves, and then as a response to white terror, the Reds finally just had enough, and they just decided to overthrow the government. But yeah, I mean, back then, half the country was basically in support of the USSR. The Reds and the Whites both had equal numbers of combatants, pretty much. Don't know about actual support. I know that the Social Democrats, who, back then, like, Social Democrats were actually Marxists. You know, like in the 1920s, Social Democrats became reformist, and that's kind of where we get the modern definition of social democracy. But back then, Social Democrats were Marxists. So the Social Democratic Party in Finland actually won the elections, but the Tsarist government didn't accept the results of the election. So most people probably support leftism. So I mean, there was the Communist Revolution. You know, in the 30s and 40s, there was the USSR Finland Friendship Association. It was created and it was banned, and then they created another one that was also banned. So the Finnish government kept trying to ban it. But despite that, it still had like 40,000 members, which is a lot for such a small country as Finland, especially at the time. Like right after the Winter War, it had like 40,000 members, and then it was banned again. So it's kind of a misconception to say that Finland and USSR were always enemies. There was always a significant portion of Finland that supported the USSR, and then there was another significant portion that really opposed it. Like the Communist Party in Finland was like huge after the Second World War. What career are you pursuing / already have? ICT, or information communications technology. So, like I said, computer-related stuff. At the moment, not so much programming or stuff like that. My current job is like very practical. It's mostly just like tech support and like physically going to locations and fixing things. But I've done, you know, a bunch of different things. But that's the general field where that I studied and that I work in. I might actually continue to study it. Graduated from university like less than a year ago, so like I'm considering continuing my studies as well. Benji Adam Wiskets asks, 1. What do you think of Nicolae Ceaucescu? I think Ceaucescu was like a classic opportunist. I don't like him. I'm not an expert, but he just seems like an extremely corrupt guy. He seems like, you know, the typical revisionist opportunist, kind of like Tito. He opposed Stalin, he opposed the USSR in favor of the West, so the West gave him money, and the West gave him like a bunch of loans, and all that shit. So he was one of those like pro-West socialists, you know. that the US imperialists basically just tried to use as a way to oppose the USSR. The United States was like basically trying to say that, you know, if you want to be a socialist, that's fine. We just don't want you to be like pro-Soviet, which was of course bullshit. They were just against socialism, and the USSR was the strongest socialist country there was, so they wanted to oppose that. So yeah, Ceaucescu was kind of an opportunist, kind of corrupt. The only reason that you would ever need to defend Ceaucescu is because of how tragic his death was. Because even though he wasn't that good, like he was kind of a scumbag, still what happened to him and what happened to his country is really tragic. You know, the right-wing media says that it was a revolution, you know, against the communist regime, but really it was just a coup. Like, basically what happened was the CIA manufactured like a demonstration against him, which, I mean, wasn't big, but it was just big enough that they could sort of use that to say that there was some popular support against him, or popular support in favor of his overthrow. And then the army basically just arrested him and shot him, and that was that. So that's what we call a coup. The army arrested him, shot him, and shot his wife. And after that, Romania went to like total shit. So that's very tragic. 2. If Assad were to win the Syrian civil war and then a communist insurgency started in Syria, would you support the insurgency? Most likely, yes. It depends a little bit on the situation. Like if it seems like doing that would just immediately cause the United States to invade and just take over everything, then maybe not. But I'm like 95% sure that I would support it. 3. What's your favorite communist song? Congratulations on 2,000 subs, comrade. Thank you. Favorite song? That's really hard. That's impossible. In terms of national anthems, I really like the Soviet anthem, of course. I really like the Finnish version of the Soviet anthem.
Niin suuri on Lenin, hän kirkasti tiemme, kun aamuun me astuimme myrskyistä yön, ja Stalinin johdolla taistoissa työssä me nousimme kuntoon sankarityön.
I like the Estonian SSR's anthem. It's a really good anthem. I like the anthem of East Germany. Songs, I like a lot of like Shostakovich communist music, and of course like all the Red Army choir stuff, but that's like, it's kind of impossible to even pick a song, like pick one song. I mean, Sacred War is like one of my favorites, so maybe I should say that. Unwanted Orchid asks, thoughts on Brexit? I have mixed feelings about Brexit, but of course I generally speaking, I support it. Like, I'm against the European Union. I'm in favor of basically every country leaving the European Union, so that the European Union will collapse. It's one of those things, like, of course in the Brexit crowd, there's basically two groups of people. There's the right-wing nationalists and right-wing racists, and then there's the leftists who oppose the European Union for reasons of, you know, imperialism. Like, they oppose EU imperialism and EU capitalism. 2. Thoughts on third worldist organizations such as RAIM, LLCO, etc. I think that people should join a good organization or a party, and I don't really care if it's third worldist or not, just if it's good. So I would say if there's a Marxist-Leninist party in your country, then you should join that. If there's like a Marxist-Leninist organization of some kind, you should join that if it's good. And if there isn't one, then I would say try to create one. I think that in the context of the US or some other countries, there's not too many good parties. So if there was like a small third worldist group in your area, I mean, you know, fine, like join that instead. Like just join a group and start to do stuff, basically. Try to spread the ideology and like organize. The LLCO, I mean, I haven't said anything about the LLCO because I try to avoid drama, but I mean, the LLCO is fucking horrible. Like it's a joke. Like, don't ever join the LLCO. I mean, the LLCO is pretty much gone anyway. The LLCO is a joke. RAIM is like an actual group that actually tries to do things, but it's really small, and it's, from what I've gathered, it's like really kind of unofficial, and it's not, you know, it's not a real party. It doesn't have a real party structure, so it's just kind of whatever. And like when it comes to the actual political line of RAIM, they seem to mostly just focus on trans issues and gender issues and things like that. Things that people would call like ID poll. In my opinion, it's not necessarily ID poll, because like ID poll is not a topic of discussion like gender rights or trans rights or something. ID poll is more like the attitude. So I don't think RAIM is necessarily like as ID poll as people say it is, but still, I mean, I don't know. It just seems like they're focusing a lot on things that are not really my priority. Don't get me wrong, we need trans rights and we need gender rights and we need all these things, but it just seems kind of odd to me. Like, none of that shit is gonna happen in capitalism anyway. Like, we need socialism to do those things anyway, so why not just focus on socialism? And like, you can talk about those things, but that's like the kind of stuff that like the most radical of the liberals also talk about. So it's not really gonna necessarily bring people over to communism. Like, maybe if it actually does, then yeah, I'll be proven wrong, but I don't know. I don't have a massive criticism of RAIM. That's just like some of the things floating around in my head.
3. Have you read any third worldist works? I'm not sure what kind of things would qualify. Like, I guess not, unless some stuff by Che Guevara is kind of considered sometimes third worldist, but like, I've read some MIM and RAIM and LLCO articles. Like, does that count? 4. When will we get a video on the Great Purge / Moscow trials? I made an attempt at that one time, but I didn't release it. You know, I've got other stuff going on, and it's, you know, it's a really big and complicated subject. So I will make one eventually, but I don't know exactly when. But I do want to make that video. 5. Thoughts on first worldism / Euro-centrism. I mean, it's basically shit, like, what can I say? Okay, 6. What are your hobbies? Well, I have tons of hobbies, to be honest, but video games, everyone plays video games, of course. I'm a big fan of horror movies and science fiction movies and movies in general, but mainly horror movies. Music, I'm a big fan of black metal music. I like death metal too, and thrash metal, but mainly, like, black metal is my thing. I mean, I like all kinds of music. Like, I like rap, old school death metal, and new sort of technical death metal, and I like jazz and prog rock and classical music and all that, but mainly black metal is my thing. I'm an amateur musician. I play the guitar, and I play keyboards and drums. I read a lot of books. I'm really into the work of H.P. Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos. It's like science fiction, horror, fantasy stuff. Like, that's, when it comes to fiction books, that's like my favorite kind of stuff. I'm also a big fan of Sherlock Holmes and Jules Verne, the French, like, really classic science fiction author. Those are, like, when it comes to fiction, those are like my 3 favorites. I think those are the most important ones that I pursue most actively. 7. Are you part of any communist groups / organizations, online and offline? I am a member of the Communist Workers' Party here in Finland, so the answer is yes. User by the name of Glenn Beck, I doubt it's actually Glenn Beck, asks, the capitalist system as we know today started with a world war. I suppose you're referring to imperialism. So yeah, modern imperialist capitalism started with a world war. Gotcha. What do you think is the likelihood that its end will be signified with a world war? Like by an imperialist world war, where all the imperialist countries fight each other again? That could happen. I mean, eventually imperialism is just gonna run into a total, basically like a brick wall, because there's no place left for it to go to expand, so
in that sense, I suppose it might cause like another redivision of the world, but currently it doesn't seem likely. Have you read economic historian Robert C. Allen's book Farm to Factory, a reinterpretation of the Soviet Industrial Revolution? I would just like your thoughts on a mainstream economist's positive opinions of the Soviet economy. I haven't read the book, but I've watched a couple of his lectures about it. The findings are interesting. It seems believable what he says, but I think his way of thinking is slightly flawed. Basically, he says that Soviet Union, had the fastest industrial growth and was really the only poor country to ever industrialize within the last century, except Japan. And he correctly pointed out that the Soviet Union industrialized totally on its own, while everyone else who has industrialized have been countries that have always been historically really wealthy, like the UK or France, or they have done it with excessive colonialism and excessive imperialism, or some kind of foreign backing. Like, for example, Japan, which is the other poor country that managed to industrialize in the last century. They, of course, did it with both imperialism, but also foreign loans and stuff like that. The Soviets, on the other hand, did it without imperialism and had no access to foreign loans. My disagreement with his analysis is that, so he basically says that, of course, like, the industrialization itself, was a really successful endeavor. Not only profitable, but it also developed society as a whole. So it was smart economically. But he doesn't think the same about the collectivization of agriculture. He says that the collectivization of agriculture also improved productivity and also gave them some return on their investment, but not nearly as much as investing in industry, which is true. So he says that while investing in industry gave a great return on investment, the cost of collectivization was very high, and it still didn't give nearly as much in return as the industrialization. But what he doesn't really take into account is that the main function of collectivization wasn't really to make money. So that's basically where his analysis is flawed. He's looking at economic growth, GDP growth, and the amount of money. And the point of collectivization wasn't to make money. Second of all, of course it's not going to make as much money because food grain is cheaper than making, machines. So of course, like, investing lots of machines into food growing, it's not going to be as profitable in terms of money. But the point of collectivization was to make more food so that they could sustain a larger population of non-farmers. That was the whole point. If you look at Soviet statistics, for example, there wasn't a totally massive increase in food production. There was always an increase in food production, but it wasn't massive. But the important thing to notice about that is that there was a massive decrease in the amount of farmers. So basically, during the industrialization, they took tons of people from the countryside and moved them into the cities to become industrial workers, but they still managed to produce more food than before. So that was the point, to basically make more food so that they can sustain a larger amount of city dwellers and urban industrial workers. It wasn't to make money, and it wasn't even to make create economic growth. It was just to make more food. Basically, without the collectivization of agriculture and without this increase in the amount of food, industrialization would have been impossible. So that's kind of why I think his analysis is a little bit flawed. Smiley asks, why is communism so hated and misunderstood? It's hated and misunderstood by some people, mostly I would say because of propaganda. So yeah, there's the massive right-wing propaganda, the constant endless propaganda. But the thing that communism actually has working against it is that it's a pretty difficult and complicated ideology compared to most ideologies. There's all kinds of easy and simple answers to questions, but they tend to be wrong. But they still tend to be more believable and more easily acceptable to people. So, some kind of right-wing ideology, liberalism, even like utopian ideologies like anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism, and less scientific left-wing ideologies like various trends of left communism, all kinds of reformist socialism, and all kinds of anarchism. Typically those ideologies are way more simplified and easy to understand. they give people easy and comfortable answers to questions which typically tend to be wrong and inaccurate, and they don't actually reflect real life, but they're easy and comfortable for people to accept. Communism is a difficult ideology, so it's easy to misrepresent, and it's easy to misunderstand.
My good friend Jay asks, what problems do you think are the most important for 21st century socialism? Well, that's the question, ain't it? Of course, there's the problem of revisionism, and the problem of developing Marxist theory for our modern situation. But, to be honest, like, if you just want to really simplify it, I would say the big problem is just to figure out what we need to do. Do we want to make legal parties and then try to win elections, or try to campaign so that we can get more popularity and then overthrow the government? Or do we want to just make illegal guerrilla groups right from the get-go and just try to use violence to overthrow the government and get to socialism? What do we want to do, and what actually works the best? Like, one thing I've been thinking about recently is how to most efficiently and effectively recruit people. There's at least two big schools of people when it comes to trying to recruit and trying to advertise your party. One school of thought is the kind of old school, like, let's just go out to the street and just hand out leaflets and flyers to people. And then there's the sort of new school of people who are all about the internet, just posting something on the internet. I think both of those have a potential of working, but I don't really know which one of them works more efficiently and which one of them is more labor intensive. Like, of course, handing out leaflets is more labor intensive, but maybe it just gets more results. Yeah, we have to figure out what do we need to do and how do we actually win, what is the best strategy. And I don't really have an answer to that, except my short-term plan is that the left needs to just regroup. We need to get more people into the movement, recruit more people, recreate communist parties in Europe and rest of the world. So that's like my short-term solution, because regardless of what our strategy ends up being, we're still gonna need more people to do it. Like, regardless if we want to try to take power legally or try to take power illegally, in both cases we still need a lot more people. So that's basically what I think we should do right now, just get more people into the movement and spread the ideology and strengthen the currently existing parties and create new ones. What's your thought on the Paris Commune? Well, of course, the Paris Commune was a great thing, great moment in history, great achievement of the working class. Now, the interesting thing about the Paris Commune is that it wasn't exclusively led by Marxists. Actually, quite a lot of the people in it were supporters of the anarchist Proudhon, but interestingly, they didn't actually apply Proudhon's ideas to how to run the commune. Instead, the commune was just run mostly based on very practical ideas and like immediate needs and what had to be done, instead of these high-minded anarchistic principles, which is something that Engels praised about the commune. He said that they did the right thing. I mean, there's been a lot of things written about the commune's mistakes. The traditional view among Marxist circles is that their two biggest mistakes were that they didn't nationalize the central bank, they didn't take over the central bank, even though they could have, and that they didn't march into Versailles and just annihilate the enemy and the enemy army when they had the chance. And I don't think it's because they were too soft or they were too forgiving, they didn't want to do it. I think they kind of lacked decisiveness. They didn't really know what they were doing a lot of the time. They had a central committee which led the commune, but the people in it didn't really know what to do. And also, even though it didn't actually follow anarchistic principles, it also didn't have that many Marxists in it, so it wasn't ideologically as developed and as advanced as it should have been. It was mostly just like a communist revolution in general, like a very spontaneous communist revolution, rather than a highly theoretically advanced and a highly planned Marxist revolution. 2. Do you think that soft drugs, LSD, marijuana, psychedelic mushrooms, and etc. should be legalized? I would say probably yeah. Like, I wouldn't recommend using any of those. Like, I suppose marijuana is kind of harmless, but if you use that, I would recommend that you don't smoke it, because, you know, smoking it still gets you the negative impacts of that. Like, it's not as bad as like smoking cigarettes, but it's still not good for your lungs and all that. I would say, if not legalized, they should at least be decriminalized. 3. What's your thought on Pol Pot? Pol Pot was a great opportunist. I don't like him, not a fan. He had no clue how to run a country. American anti-communist propaganda blames him for, like, killing 4 million people or something. Like, actually, he killed like 40,000 people. But millions of people died of starvation during his rule, or during the Civil War, basically. And he couldn't really put an end to that. He didn't really know what to do and how to run a country. He called himself a Maoist just to get aid from China, basically. But his ideology was stupid. He was a utopian idealist. He thought that, like, urbanization and industrialization are bad and that city dwellers are just bad. He was kind of like Makhno. Like, very similar. Like, just total, utter failure to run a country, just like Makhno. This, like, crazy anti-intellectualism and crazy anti-urbanite sentiment. Very similar to Makhno. His Majesty Gui, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks, what do you think about Maoism and the Cultural Revolution? Okay, I largely support Maoism. I would say that apart from just Marxist-Leninists, Maoists are the closest thing to me. I support Maoists and Hobbies and Marxist-Leninists, but like I said, I'm not a Maoist because I don't entirely agree with all of Maoism. And it's not even that I don't agree with them, it's just that I don't think they are universal, and I don't think they're objectively like a new stage of Marxism or something. I think it's more just an application of Marxism rather than a new development of Marxism. But Cultural Revolution, like, this is another one of my disagreements with Maoism. Maoists, they typically like to say that the Cultural Revolution represents the highest level of socialism and the highest, the best example of socialism ever achieved and the closest thing to full communism. And like all that, they talk about it like they say that it's this new fantastic stage of revolutionary science and all that shit. But really, what is a cultural revolution? There's two things about the cultural revolution. There's the culture part. So you get rid of old culture, you replace it with progressive communist culture. But that's not a new idea. Like, that's not something that Mao invented. I mean, the Soviet Union already did that. Not in the same exact way and not to the same degree. In the Cultural Revolution, there was more mass participation, like, all at once. But still, the idea of a cultural revolution is not all that unique to Maoism. And Mao already talked about a cultural revolution before the People's Republic of China was even created. Like in the article that he wrote called On New Democracy, where he's basically talking about new democracy, he already outlines that they need a cultural revolution, as in just, you know, new proletarian culture. But then there's the other big aspect of the cultural revolution, which was overthrowing the right-wing bourgeois faction in the party. And to me, that's more important, or more significant, if we talk about new developments of Marxism. Because Mao was the first real big anti-revisionist. Like, that to me is his biggest contribution. And really, to me, the most important development that Maoism has come up with, and basically the most important teaching of Maoism, in my opinion, can be summed up by the slogan, "It is always right to rebel against reactionaries." Let me repeat, it is always right to rebel against reactionaries. That is a very important thing, and it sounds sort of self-evident, but it really isn't. And it is actually quite different from the Soviet sort of Stalin-era understanding. And, you know, for good reasons, of course. Like, in the context of the Stalin government and even the Lenin government, when people were rebelling against the government, they were almost exclusively right-wingers, czarists, or they were other kinds of wreckers like anarchists, or just soldiers who were mutinying because they wanted more money, or railway workers who wanted more money, or they were like bourgeois officials that the communist government needed to use. Like all kinds of people like that who just rebelled and organized their own strikes against the Bolshevik government because they wanted more money, or because they didn't like communism. Trotskyist opposition, and all these people who were just like really shitty people basically just complaining because they wanted more money and they wanted more personal benefit from the system and more personal gain, or they were just power hungry like the Trotskyists. Trotsky didn't even have a very strong political position on most things. He just wanted to be in power himself. That's why he changed his mind so much, and that's why he lied so much, is because when he was finally kicked out of the Soviet Union, he reversed almost all of his previous statements just because it was politically advantageous to him to basically just start to lie about things that he previously hadn't lied about, and to start to oppose things that he had previously supported just because Stalin was doing them. So, in the Stalin context, the people who rebelled against the government were almost exclusively reactionaries. So, in their mind, there's no way that you should rebel against the socialist government. But in the context of China, the government was kind of taken over by these right-wingers. So, of course, Mao correctly saw that they need to be ousted. In the Soviet Union, of course, there was always the political struggle, like Trotsky and his buddies, who were, until 1927, they were still in the government, competing for power. But it was kind of clear that Stalin was winning, whereas in China, Mao was kind of losing in the power struggle. So it's a very important thing to realize that you can and you must rebel against the government if the government is actually doing something wrong. If the communist government is actually doing something wrong. Now, of course, this opens up a whole bunch of new difficult problems, like when is the right time to rebel? Like, what is too much? Because if the government is just slightly wrong, then you might not want to just try to overthrow it. You might try to push it into the right direction. It has to be pretty egregious for you to need to actually try to overthrow it. Because remember, when you're fighting against the government, that also makes it easier for imperialism to attack, because you have the right-wing faction of the communists fighting with the left-wing faction of the communists, basically. That kind of infighting always makes us weaker against the imperialists. But anyway, to me that is the most important thing that Mao came up with in terms of theoretical concepts. The Soviet revisionist critique of the Cultural Revolution was literally that it's wrong because it's illegal, which is, really funny, actually. I don't agree with the Hobbies critique of the Cultural Revolution either, but at least that made a little bit more sense. The Hobbies critique of Cultural Revolution was that the party wasn't in control of the country anymore, that the party wasn't leading, that the party was kind of lagging behind this massive, spontaneous mass movement instead of leading it. And I think that's partially true, but it's not entirely true. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Cultural Revolution as a whole was a bad thing.